everyone, and welcome to our webinar on accelerating smart manufacturing. Let me introduce myself. I'm Heather Ashton. I'm the manufacturing research leader in our Deloitte Center for Energy and Industrials. I'm joined today by an esteemed group of panelists: Paul Wellner, Vice Chairman, U.S. Industrial Products Leader at Deloitte; David Beckhoff, Vice President of Product Development and Insights at MAPI, the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation; Mike Sayan, Vice President of Siemens Digital Exchange at Siemens Digital Industries; and Andrew Witherspoon, the Vice President of Manufacturing Thought Leadership at Salesforce. So we have a great packed agenda for you. We'd really like to share. We're going to actually start with a look at a report that Deloitte and MAPI recently published on smart manufacturing ecosystems, and I'm going to ask Paul and David to take us through some of those insights. So I'll hand it off to Paul.
Thank you for that great introduction. As Heather said, I am the leader of the Deloitte Industrial Products practice, and really glad to be here with David today, as well as with the team from Siemens and Salesforce. The study that Heather referred to was done just this summer and fall of 2020. We had over 800 respondents on a global basis. They represented all sizes of organizations, as well as all different kinds of end markets as it relates to industrial products and manufacturing. We felt pretty good about the response, and it was up a few hundred respondents from the study that we did in 2019. Also, it's kind of focused on smart manufacturing and the things going on inside the four walls of the facility. But this study has begun to focus on ecosystems, as Heather mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward through the presentation. But first, some updated results. Number one finding we had was that 4 in 10 of our respondents have paused their manufacturing or smart manufacturing investments. The good news is those aren't permanent pauses, but the majority of them are going to restart their manufacturing and smart manufacturing or digital or Industry 4.0 type activities in the next 12 months. As you can see, a quarter of them are going to restart relatively quickly, and then another half are going to restart in the 7 to 12 month time frame. I'd say some other good news from a manufacturing standpoint are, it's not that 4 in 10 have paused, but it's 6 in 10 or 60% are continuing their investments in smart and digital. And in fact, those that are continuing their investments are allocating more. So in 2019, in the study that we did, they were focusing 30% of their investments on smart and digital, and now they're up to 36%. So a 20% increase over year in the amount of money being allocated to smart and digital investments. As we move to that next slide, what we're seeing is a lot of different areas for investment in smart and digital. We at Deloitte, along with MAPI, defined what we call the 8 great use cases for smart and digital manufacturing. At the top of the list is quality sensing and detection, and at the bottom of the list is smart conveyance. And in between, there's various different use cases that might touch on the workforce, might touch on energy, might touch on digital in the concept of digital twins, may connect on factory synchronization and dynamic scheduling. So we think there's a lot of areas covered in those 8 great use cases, and that's really where most manufacturers are focused. The way to read this slide, though, is if you think about on the far right-hand side, it's the share of manufacturers who have invested in those 8 great use cases. So at the highest end, quality sensing and detecting and factory asset intelligence and performance management, registering 85 and 84% of the manufacturers who are investing in these areas, investing in smart, or investing in those 2 use cases. And at the bottom of the list, still a very high number, smart conveyance, with 65% of the manufacturers that we surveyed investing in areas around smart conveyance. The second way to look at the chart is the numbers that are in the middle. Those are the share of manufacturers who are really able to operationalize. Read that as they were able to drive benefits, meaningful levels of benefits out of those investments. This is probably where there's a little bit more disappointment in the study, and it's relatively low numbers who have been able to drive the benefits, across their organization. So if you think of it, it ranges between 21% on the low end, up to 36% on the high end. So we could call it roughly a third of those manufacturers, investing in smart have been able to drive benefits. We think that presents a tremendous amount of upside for organizations as they invest to be able to drive benefits out of their smart manufacturing investments. One of the things that we're seeing in the recent study, and David will go into this in much greater detail, is that the notion of an ecosystem could be the key to unlocking that value creation and value realization from smart manufacturing initiatives. A simple way to look at it is going at it alone versus kind of bringing the A team to a problem. So those organizations historically have been going at things alone versus thinking through ecosystems. And from what we were able to see in this recent study, ecosystems are really a growing part of creating solutions. We had to then define, if you will, buckets for where those ecosystems would play. As you can see on the slide here, we've got 4 buckets described. Frankly, you also have to think about the intersection of those 8 great use cases with these 4 buckets. We're not going to dive into that at this moment, but those use cases definitely apply around these 4 major buckets of ecosystems. I'm going to start in the bottom left with production. Think about that as being the 4 walls of manufacturing. That's where we have production-oriented ecosystems, and you can see some of the players that are in that ecosystem. If we go to the upper right-hand corner, the supply chain, that begins to extend outside of the 4 walls of manufacturing. And again, you can see some of the ecosystem players in the supply chain space. I'll move to the upper left, the customer side of things. This is really where consumer industries have been driving very, very significantly, and we're seeing the industrial and the manufacturing businesses driving in this area as well. How do our customer-oriented interactions and customer-oriented ecosystems continue to evolve? So those are the 3 main pieces, if you will, of the external facing part of the ecosystem. To me, the most important and interesting part of the ecosystem, though, is talent. We at Deloitte did a study with NAM 2 years ago in 2018 and identified 2.4 million jobs as part of a skills gap in our country. Talent is a huge strategic need for our manufacturing clients and manufacturing organizations across the country. If you think about talent and how it's evolved over the years, we've seen people with careers that are 30 and 40 and 50 years inside of some manufacturing organizations. I don't think we're going to see that in the future. We're going to see talent, happening in very different ways. The gig economy is going to bring, new kinds of talent into manufacturing workforces, employment service providers, government programs, apprenticeship programs, linkages with academia, linkages with community colleges, linkages with technical and training centers and affiliations are all going to help bring talent into the manufacturing workforce. I think you'll love to hear some of the additional insights that are come from David as we get further into the next section. David, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and thank you to you and to Heather for the great collaboration with MAPI on this research. And hello, everyone. I'm David Beckoff. I lead research at MAPI, and I get to pick up on the ecosystem story here in a very good place in talking more about why we care so much, what we mean by ecosystems, and some principles to realize the benefits. Among the key findings from the research is what you see on the screen here. And we quantified the benefits from a subset of manufacturers who reported applying an ecosystem approach as compared to those who did not. And you can see in the circles how ecosystems amplify impact with the 20-point swings in the categories in front of us. And so going from left to right, just to hit a few highlights here, products to market faster. This is happening because companies are able to use available resources that others have and you may not to enhance capabilities and increase speed. Expanded innovation, central for the benefits of smart manufacturing, and your organizations are able to really enable their own resources to focus on competitive advantages while bringing new ideas in-house from sources like incubators or startups. And then overall, this acceleration in digital maturity, there's, again, the additional capabilities and know-how that you may not have in-house where you can learn how to advance further and faster and in a sustainable way. And finally here, reducing operational costs through greater efficiencies. This is, of course, really critical. Ecosystem investments can bring cost savings over time, very important for making the business case. And because the new technology and use cases, things like predictive maintenance, improve efficiency. So with some of these benefits in mind, then we'll shift to what is the ecosystem, and the visual on the next page will help here. What you can see here, I'll orient you to the page first by looking at the top left, where we refer to a company with 3 existing connections. So this is the baseline example of a manufacturer with 3 primary connections in a vendor network. So IT software vendors, operational technology, and the physical automation and robotics vendors that you see on that top left. But the web of connections that you see here really implies that much of the ecosystem is disconnected if you don't consider the other aspects on the page right now. There's a lot of untapped potential. So what happens is, if we go now to what you see there as the plus sign on the bottom left, when this company connects with a ecosystem convener, in addition to those first 3 connections, we see that the convener unlocks value with new relationships and a new use case, as Paul had talked about with those grade 8 of the use cases here on quality sensing and detecting. And that's coming through new capability with technology and an ability to solve for interoperability issues. So add to this example the other plus sign of a convener on the top right, and we're unlocking even more potential here in terms of predictive maintenance. And so this is a visual to help understand what we mean in unlocking the potential and the tangible benefits of an ecosystem approach. And you get the idea of how a manufacturer can scale this outward for new use cases, as each of the dots in the ecosystem brings new capabilities. And so what you might be saying is, well, we in our organization work with a network of some really good technology providers. Well, what's the difference? And we'll talk about that on the next slide. And of course, many companies do rely heavily on partners, but what we distinguish is that they may not necessarily, even their own self-reporting, activate an ecosystem approach. And that's where there may be value that's not captured. So here, just to call out the point on the page, even though 73% of manufacturers told us in the study that they were heavily reliant on outside partners to progress, even more so than in-house development, you can see in the roadmap on the bottom that many in the survey report that their actual ecosystem maturity is lagging. So companies are not necessarily activating the connections to realize the benefits we had just talked about. And so you can see this from the far left, the 2%, 13%, 29%. There's a group here that are in the planning stages for an ecosystem approach. About a third that would say that they have strategic relationships in place, but only that small slice of 16% are deploying an ecosystem approach. So the key point of this page is that a network of vendors is not the same as deploying an ecosystem approach, and this represents really the big opportunity at stake and for our conversation today to accelerate smart manufacturing. So again, what distinguishes the ecosystem approach? Well, let's talk about that on the next slide. And it's really deliberate and purposeful coordination. To sum it up, that is deliberately forming the ecosystem is what differentiates manufacturers. And the partners, of course, really, really matter. And we heard that in the interviews that we did with executives on this topic. And the ecosystem players and then those conveners specifically or especially bring new capability to advance maturity in smart manufacturing. And this is true of both individual use cases and many of the use cases in aggregate that Paul mentioned earlier. And so a few principles to keep in mind here. We have, deliberate coordination, select partners that you can scale and grow with, shared business objectives, help to connect these help to connect the community for collaboration, measurable impacts or results, consistently focus on those same goals to accelerate time to value. And then again, to underscore the point, the value of the convener, we find this can be really the active ingredient to help with the interoperability and complexity issues in play. So making entities come together in meaningful ways, deliberately in this purposeful manner, is what will strengthen your ecosystem and close the gap in operationalizing the use cases that Paul talked about. And I look forward to getting into the examples and experiences with our panelists today. So thank you. And Heather, back to you.
Thanks so much, David. Very helpful to hear some of the key insights from the study. This slide is actually a good transition to our next speaker, Mike Sayan, the Vice President of Siemens Digital Exchange at Siemens Digital. Mike, how does the ecosystem approach apply to the work you're doing at Siemens?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So we have a slide to kind of set the context for you. Within Siemens, we have some very extensive networks. They're the core of our business. Over the 173 years that we've been in business, we've gotten really good at building networks, and they're essential to how we deliver our electrification and our automation solutions to our customers. As you can imagine, those networks are both customer-facing for delivering the solutions to the customer, as well as supply chain-facing. We also have networks for knowledge, both within our company and with external players, to kind of share information within the employee base and with academics within our customer base, et cetera, just knowledge exchange, not necessarily formal commercialized product exchange. Those networks are really mature. They've evolved over time. They've been optimized for really cost efficiency, as well as to being fast to market. But there's some characteristics to them. They tend to be structured, so they have policies and procedures and things you have to do in order to become a member of the network. They tend to be hierarchical. We stack them up in tiers in terms of tier 1 suppliers and tier 2 suppliers and distributors and OEMs. They tend to be very stable, which means they don't change very fast. That's great. Those networks continue to operate. To some degree, they're shifting more towards an ecosystem approach as things change. But for the most part, they're working really, really well for us. A few years ago, though, about 13 years ago, we started focusing more on software and on the digital transformation of both our manufacturing processes and the manufacturing processes of our customers. That was because the market itself was changing for us and our customers to be much more dynamic. The technology was changing fast. The customer needs are changing fast. The way in which we have to bring products to market is changing fast. Those very stable, efficient networks were not necessarily the right way to go forward. And so we needed to think of a different approach that was agile, that was flexible, that allowed people to come in and out of the network or in and out of the ecosystem as quickly as possible. And that's the ecosystem approach that we're working on now. We call that our platform ecosystems, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through the panel discussions. But just to give a little bit of context to it, we started from basics. We looked at customers and what they needed from us and from the ecosystem. We didn't look just at immediately what they needed from Siemens, but what the overall solution was that would really help them digitally transform their manufacturing businesses, all the way from engineering through production and into the service of the products. As the internet and as digital technologies start to spread out through the whole life cycle of a product and production process. That required a digital transformation. You don't change just little things. You have to think holistically in terms of the overall product and overall processes. It requires very open innovation. Siemens can't do it all. We like to do it all, but really, in order to solve that big of a problem, you need to bring together lots of different players working closely with the customer in order to really transform their businesses. And we've done the same thing for our own business. Some of our factories are really awesome in terms of how they've gone through the digital transformation process. So open innovation was important. In order to have that openness, trust level, et cetera, you need an ecosystem, and you need to be able to support that ecosystem over time. It's not a matter of building it and then it kind of just exists by itself. It has to be well thought out, and we talked about that a little bit earlier during the survey results. It has to be really well thought out, and it has to be sustainable. One of the things that allows us to sustain our ecosystems relative to the products we provide to our customers, as well as the way in which we've implemented those products within our own manufacturing processes, are platforms, digital platforms. And MindSphere is one of those platforms that we'll talk about a little bit more later on. In order for a lot of different players to come together and build solutions on a common platform, there has to be a way to bring that to the customers in a well-reasoned way. If everybody was selling their own products through different channels, it's really hard for the customer to pull that all together and implement it in their system. Doing that once is a challenge, but with software products in particular, those things are changing constantly, and so you need a way to bring new versions of the software into the customer's manufacturing environment very quickly. That's what we use marketplaces for. And that's really where we've been focusing with Salesforce and Deloitte, was establishing the marketplaces that support our digital platforms, that support our overall digital transformation, both for Siemens and for our customers. So Salesforce has been part of our CRM backbone, if you would, for our software business for many, many years. And when we started looking around at different ways in which to build the marketplace, they were a natural fit with Salesforce B2B Commerce. Deloitte, as one of the key implementation partners for Salesforce with B2B Commerce, was a natural fit as our systems integration partner to build out the marketplaces. And both of them were great to work with, and I'm really, really pleased to be here to participate in this panel discussion. Back to you, Heather.
Thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate that and look forward to further discussion when we get into the panel. But first, let's answer a couple of polling questions. This is an opportunity for the audience to help share with us some of their thoughts and insights around where you're currently. And you can see, hopefully on your screen, the first question just came up. What ecosystems are you pursuing in your company? And this is multiple choice, so you can select as many as apply based on the definition that Paul shared with us earlier. And while we wait for the results to come in, Mike, I'm just curious, with that marketplace, did you ever think of going it alone?
We did. We're a commercial software company, so we always advise our customers to use a commercial solution rather than trying to build custom solutions. But we weren't sure a commercial solution was really available for what we needed. We started our first online store about 8 years ago, and we were using an online reseller to do that. And we learned a lot from that. And some of the things we learned about is the need to really tightly connect the online customer journey with our traditional sales teams, right? Which is very hard to do when you have an external marketplace. The other thing is MindSphere in particular, being a digital platform, we need to be able to connect the marketplace with the digital platform so that as customers bought things, they'd be automatically deployed into the platform. Going with a commercial solution didn't seem feasible. On the other hand, we really needed a way to be competitive with our marketplace compared to everybody else. And that was a daunting task. Well, it turned out when we looked out at different solution providers that B2B Commerce actually solved both of those problems for us. They allow us to connect because B2B Commerce is built on our Salesforce instance, but they also allow us to very easily extend it so we can connect it into our digital platforms.
Very good. That's great. Let's just see what the audience came back with in terms of the ecosystems they're pursuing. Look at that. So that's great. I know from our research study, the production and supply chain ecosystems were tended to be the most popular, and I'm really happy to see this customer kind of ecosystems really showing up here because it is such an important part of that overall way that manufacturers deliver value. So understanding and identifying how to reach that customer and work through the customer ecosystem is certainly important. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for that. Let's move to the next polling question. We just have one more. What is your top challenge related to adopting an ecosystem approach? There are a few here, and this one is just select the one that most resonates with you right now. And while we're waiting for those answers to come in, I'm going to ask David a question based on the research. So what did the study show in terms of the top challenges that manufacturers are facing when they were thinking about adopting an ecosystem approach?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I think that when we, both from the data collection and when we spoke with executives, there are really four issues that came up most. I think one is just the complexity challenge, coordination across an ecosystem of vendors that requires a lot of careful coordination. I think the other thing is we heard quite a bit of a challenge just in variation across the factory footprint, both in skills and capabilities. And then I'd bucket two together, which is really around data protection and cybersecurity, along with the IP challenges from just the information sharing and data that's involved. So that would be a set that of challenges that we heard, but very interested to see how this compares to what those on the line have to say.
Excellent. All right. So did anything surprise you, David, here?
I think that that not so much as a surprise as a validation, the lack of experience and how to engage with the ecosystem. I think when we think back to that data point about the 16% that this is emerging, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, the first one up here on IP just mentioned that has been an issue that we've seen at MAPI and more of our polling, and also in the research earlier this year as a challenge when we talk about ecosystems. So this more consistent than it is a surprise.
Very true. Yes. And I will say that our study, I think you may have received a copy of that prior to this webinar, but we also have, as part of that, we call it a playbook for accelerating smart manufacturing ecosystems. That's free to download as well. And that actually gives some good insights about that, where to start, right? How to get started if you do feel that you're lacking experience. So I'm sure we can share those links out after the webinar. Thanks again, David. I really appreciate your participation today and your insights.
Thank you.
I think we're going to move into our panel discussion now. So I'd like to invite Mike and Paul back in, and also, again, reintroduce Andrew Witherspoon and welcome him, the Vice President of Manufacturing Thought Leadership for Salesforce. I thought the best way to start this conversation, because we are all coming from different aspects of the ecosystem, Salesforce, Siemens, and Deloitte, is what exactly do we mean when we talk about an ecosystem approach from each of our perspectives? And so it'd be really helpful. Maybe we'll start with you, Andrew. How does Salesforce kind of view that when you talk about an ecosystem approach?
Well, thank you, Heather. Thanks for the question. I'm happy to be here. Well, I think the best way to answer that from a Salesforce perspective is kind of talk about our journey for an ecosystem. So Salesforce is currently about 20 years old, about 20 billion in revenue, 54,000 employees. And we started our journey actually in the mid-2000s, 15 years ago, based on a conversation between Mark Benioff, our CEO, and Steve Jobs, of all people, talking about the Apple ecosystem he was working in. And it kind of inspired Mark to really take a look at the potential impact. And we were able to see that we were growing 20% per year. We were able to sell more software than our customers could actually consume or implement. So we knew we had to expand the footprint. And in fact, we've been successful to the point where IDC did a white paper on this. And over the next 5 years, the Salesforce ecosystem will encompass 4.2 million jobs and 1.2 trillion in revenue. So it can have a very significant impact if you really look at it holistically. But I think as the experts just overviewed for us in the presentation, it requires a dedicated part of the organization that's really focused on it, because it's a very different motion than doing everything yourself directly. Paul, did you have any thoughts from Deloitte's perspective?
Yeah, Andrew, just kind of piggybacking on that, and maybe weaving in one of the questions that has come across our Q&A, this notion of a convener, inside of an ecosystem. And any one of us can play that convener role. Sometimes a third-party outside consultant like Deloitte can be a convener. Sometimes a solution provider like Siemens can be the convener. Sometimes an already existing software ecosystem like what has happened at Salesforce, or some of the other things that Andrew mentioned, could play the convener role. It just depends on the situation. It depends on the use case. It depends on the kind of the need of the organization, whether it's one of those organizations that said, like the 37% we just saw in the polling question, where experience was important, and where do you get that experience from the outside, or those that might need help with change management, the other 16%. So I think we'll see it play out very differently in very different places. And if you think about the 8 great use cases, they play in very different places as well. Quality, I think, is much more of kind of a known commodity inside of the four walls of manufacturing organizations, where things that might involve robotics, artificial intelligence, advanced analytics are areas that there might be need for more help from the ecosystem to help manufacturers move from point A to point B.
Great point, Paul, and so true about that convener role, certainly. Let's talk about. I think it'd be interesting for us also to talk about from that business perspective, right? So, what are some of the examples of the business challenges or opportunities for which an ecosystem approach can really help accelerate results? And Mike, I'd really like to hear from you first around, again, especially that marketplace that you've worked on.
Well, if we go back to basics, it's all about agility, right? How to create a sufficient agility within your business, within your manufacturing business, to address those market dynamics that are happening, right? So, and there's lots of different places where you need agility. You need agility in your engineering environment, which means you need to have an engineering ecosystem that brings together the best in thought product designs and bring them together into a common environment. Almost no system is totally designed by just one company. It's designed by lots of different companies and it has to come together at the systems level. And you want to do that fast, right? The same thing's true with production. The production line that you have, you want to be able to do that with send multiple products down through the same production line, have the production line self-configure itself. To do that, you're talking about solutions from lots of different companies, not just one. So again, if they work together in an ecosystem, they're going to come up with a more innovative way of delivering that production line than if they had done it more in an ecosystem approach. The other thing is just remember, when we talk about customer, it's not just a single manufacturing customer. They've got a huge network today, ecosystem in the future of providers. And each one of those providers is actually talking to multiple customers, right? They can't afford to create these digital connections, different, unique digital connections with every provider. They need to have a way of building something and then bringing it out to all of their customers that are solving those same kinds of problems. That's where the networks, the digital platforms in the marketplace come in, because the marketplace really gives them a way of offering their solution to multiple customers, delivering it, in a timely fashion and keeping it up to date.
Very true. No, that's helpful. I know, Paul, I'd love to add you into this because I know Deloitte works with a number of our customers who are manufacturing companies who also need to get to their customers, and we help them do that. I know we've got something in development at the Smart Factory at Wichita. Maybe you can share some of that in the context of this sort of convening and bringing together an ecosystem to solve challenges or opportunities.
Yeah, I'd love to. I do want to comment on two things that Mike said, and they really resonated with me. Both the speed, he used the word fast, and agility. I think those are really critical as marketplaces continue to move very rapidly. The only way we're able to, react, and I shared some of these thoughts in a press briefing on Tuesday, it's the focus on agility and how do we've just gone through and are in the midst of going through a global pandemic driven by a virus, but there's lots of other things that have driven disruptions in our businesses in the past, and our ability, as manufacturing organizations to be agile and adapt to, those black swan type events that happen is going to be really critical to us and our success in the future. Just maybe thinking about Wichita that Heather mentioned, this is a Deloitte Smart Factory on the Wichita State University campus that we're bringing together many ecosystem partners together to work inside the four walls of a factory that will actually make a product that is going to be donated to educational institutions. But think about how we pull together systems providers, hardware providers, cloud providers, 5G providers, analytics providers, bring in the university as a new source of labor, connect into other kind of sources outside of the those large company ecosystems. How do we bring in small companies that are incubator type companies that are bringing really innovative products to the marketplace that could be key nodes, in an ecosystem, whether it's, as David described, in a couple spaces or whether it's along the lines of our 8 great use cases. So Wichita is a place where you as manufacturers can come and see some of these things taking shape firsthand, without, going through your own experimentation, leveraging frankly, us as an ecosystem partner to help experiment and develop new solutions.
Sure. I think that kind of tactile experiential aspect is really important, especially as as you had mentioned before, many of these new emerging technologies are not necessarily, very familiar to many manufacturers. So being able to kind of interact with them in an experiential way is certainly helpful. Along those lines of customer, I want to bring you back in, Andrew, because we had a question come in as well about, how the customer fits into the typical manufacturing ecosystem. And I'm curious how, again, your thoughts are about solving some of those business challenges or opportunities, right, through the customer lens. So, Andrew, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, of course, it's always ultimately about the customer, but customers, particularly, it's been interesting in manufacturing with COVID, because we're seeing a lot of interest in going direct to the end customer. Most distributors, most manufacturers go through distribution or retailers or other channel partners, but now they want to get closer to the end customer. One, to better serve and understand them from a product development perspective, but also to get better access to the data that the customer interactions are generating. So our focus is really ultimately about making the customer successful, not only at the organizational level with the ecosystem, but also at the individual level. When I think one of our better ideas was actually opening up our training for Salesforce to be free to all of our customers. So to allow individuals within an organization to train up and become a member of the ecosystem and give them new career opportunities. So it can be done very holistically. Other examples come from, say, automotive, for example, where not only do you have to embrace your distributors and dealers, but you also need to reach through those distributors and dealers to the service providers who are actually servicing the vehicles, all the way down to the mechanics that are working in the service providers. And then ultimately the end customer is the truck or car owner. So really building a strategy around all those different facets and then weaving them together so you can help each be more successful than they would be alone.
Yeah, that's so true that there's so many levels of customer in a manufacturing environment that's different than other industries. And I really like what you said too about the talent side. So as Paul mentioned, talent ecosystems are so important, and that whole notion of upskilling. So the fact that Salesforce offered that upskilling capability throughout your customer organizations is great. I think we need to see more of that, right, as we kind of move forward into this digital world, definitely. The next question that came in is about barriers. So what are some of the key barriers to really building or an ecosystem program? And I'm going to start with you, Mike, since I think you've probably passed through some of those in your processes and on your pathway.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're passed through them yet. So I'll talk about two of them in particular. One is, how do you go to market as an ecosystem, right? In our case, we're very much used to being an enterprise that sells to our customers, either through a channel, as you talked about, or even direct in some cases. And we're really focused on maximizing our share of the customer's wallet, right? So solving a problem and maximizing our share of it. In an ecosystem, you can't do that. You have to think about the mutual success of all the ecosystem members. So this marketplaces help with that, because marketplaces have an open playing field, if you would, for all the solution providers to bring their solutions to the customer. But marketplace isn't enough. There's also this connection with the direct sales teams, and you have to figure out a way to incentivize the direct sales team in order to cooperate in an ecosystem mode, right? You have to think broader about what really is the success from a sales perspective, and how you're going to reward those salespeople for that success. That's one part of it. The other barrier that we're dealing with right now, that we're thinking about, we're not dealing with it yet, is data. And it was talked about a little bit earlier about Paul. Ecosystems, marketplaces, there's lots of data there. And sharing that data is part of the value of the ecosystem of the marketplace. The trick is how to do that in a way that doesn't trigger anti-competitive behavior. You got to adhere to the regulations. You have to be thinking about what data you can share and what you can't share. And you need the systems in place to kind of help you do the right thing every time, versus giving into some of our instincts to kind of optimize things for our own businesses. So those two barriers for us: how do you go to market, and how do you share data appropriately within the marketplace to get the most value from the data?
Yeah, that's so true. And you just brought up that sort of data sharing. And as David mentioned, that came up in our study, and he's actually, MAPI is working on another study where intellectual property theft and concerns about, again, how you're sharing, and like you said, anti-competitive behaviors even, that's certainly an issue. Paul, what are your thoughts about some of the barriers?
Yeah, I think I was going to say, our survey respondents said intellectual property was kind of number two behind experience. And I think that's something that what echoes with me as I talk to clients about ecosystems. It's really kind of creating, and Mike alluded to it, it's the right kind of incentives, the right kind of level of trust where the network makes the right decisions versus the individual companies making the right decisions. And it's a really hard, really nuanced kind of change that has to take place, but it does have to take place. And once you get over that hump, then you become, not that you're not going to protect your intellectual property, but you feel better that it's not going to be abused, right, or used in a way that is counter to what the the ecosystem would be thinking about. That's notwithstanding, we have certain bad actors around the world, and we have certain economies where there is more intellectual property misuse than others. So I mean, we're not going to take our guards down and say everybody gets everything, but we've got to think about it in the terms of the ecosystems, and it's having kind of the capabilities that come with platforms like Salesforce that allow you to think about how you protect that information in a different fashion.
Certainly. Yeah. Andrew, do you want to add on to that? Speaking of sort of Salesforce and.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, having worked in alliance organizations in the past, it's one of the biggest barriers, particularly for manufacturers, because they're typically led by engineers, is the lack of control you get when you work with partners in ecosystems. It requires a different kind of business culture where you have to have more trust and transparency and willingness to admit that you can't do it all yourself. And sometimes that's hard for organizations to get their head around. And then there's a very specific set of skills that you need in the organization to both recruit, support, and grow those partners. Because many of these partners often can be, relatively small versus the primary manufacturer, but they can have critical roles. And so being able to work with organizations of all sizes and types, as well as the culture of building partnerships, is critical in my experience.
Sure, that definitely. Some good discussions and thoughts for kind of those barriers that might be preventing some manufacturers from thinking about adopting ecosystems. And of course, we saw that top sort of challenge that this audience is facing is that lack of experience, right? So maybe we should shift over to a question on how do you get started? What does it look like in terms of where to go first? Andrew, I don't know if you wanna start that conversation?
Sure. Well, typically you're going to get your best ideas, and we do this from a product development standpoint as well, as we actually go out to our customers and we ask them, where are you not using Salesforce to solve your business problems? Or where are you doing a lot of customization? And we look for those white spaces, and then we come up with a strategy that we build it ourselves, we acquire it, or we partner for it. So we have a very conscious strategy in our industry team for manufacturing around how we approach that. And so normally you want to look for those adjacencies where the 1 + 1 = 3 is pretty obvious, and then you can kind of build from there. But I think it was mentioned earlier by Paul and Mike that there's a lot of complexity involved, and so it's easy to get in too deep if you move too quickly. So it's taken 10 to 15 years for Salesforce to build the ecosystem. So I think the high value areas is where I would recommend starting. Mike, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, totally agree with you. I've lost track of I was listening so closely, I lost track of the question. Heather, what was the question again?
Yeah,
how to get started, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
in our case, we got started by looking internal to Siemens, right? So looking at ourselves as a manufacturing company, we have a ton of domain expertise on how this really works. And so we looked first internally, but then we very quickly looked externally and talked to customers, but also suppliers, and said, okay, what do you need? What kind of tools do you need? How can we help you work in this more dynamic world? And then it's a matter of starting slow. I mean, we have the networks, they're usually part of the networks, and you have to give them an ability to transition from their network approach into an ecosystem approach. And that's a change management exercise. And it requires cultural change and mindset changes, as well as a technology change and process changes. It takes time, right? And in often cases, we don't have that much time. So but how we got started and how we suggest customers, it's really looking at the business problem you're trying to solve, and then figuring out how to do that in a stepwise way using digital technology. We're pretty big on using digital technology.
Very true. And also so important what you just said is that start with the business problem, right? You don't start with the technology and then try to find a use case for it. You start with your business.
Again, what Andrew said with engineers, we tend to want to start with the technology.
Right.
In this case, we got to start with the business problem.
Most definitely. Yes. No, that makes a lot of sense. We had a good question come in just now, and I think it's very, very current, of course. And I'm going to address this one to Paul. How have manufacturing organizations reacted to the COVID crisis in terms of achieving their smart manufacturing initiatives? I know you've done some work in that area, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
And I do have to admit, I'm a recovering engineer as well, so I get I focus on shiny objects too, and like to see how we can apply them in different places. But as both Andrew and Mike said, it's more important to follow the money and figure out where the business problems are and how you can then find the right set of solutions to kind of solve the business problem. You know, from a COVID standpoint, if we go back to one of my first slides, right, we talked about the 60% of organizations that are still keeping their smart manufacturing initiatives rolling, and that in 2019 we saw them investing about 30% of their dollars, on smart and digital type activities inside of their organizations. And in 2020, the number was 36% that we saw investing in those same kinds of things. And if you think about the timing of our survey, we were in the market basically in the August timeframe doing surveying. So, for most organizations, kind of the second quarter and part of the third quarter were pretty low points this last year. Second quarter worse than third. Third, we were seeing upticks. It just really depended on, your end markets. Again, we had some markets that were booming, right? Everybody had the next new toilet paper, whether you're trying to buy a lawnmower or a refrigerator or find a gallon of paint for your house. There were a lot of things that were supply constrained, but there are other things that were demand constrained, right? Which was, none of us are getting on airplanes and those kinds of things. So what we saw with manufacturers is, this is a term we used in our 2019 study, that we found the leading organizations and we named them trailblazers. David's very familiar with that term. But those trailblazer organizations, from what we could see in 2020, really continued to spend dollars as related to digital type things in the pandemic. We've also seen, we've all who have the ability to move to remote work, we've all moved to remote work. And we've got, things like Zoom and WebEx and Teams that we used a little bit in 2019, but now, we're all on these calls multiple hours every day. And those tools have been one element of digitization of processes outside of the factory. So we're seeing organizations digitize, virtualize, all sorts of different processes that we never thought they'd be able to do in the past, us included. And I'm sure, both Salesforce and Siemens have experienced the same things.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear about that. Mike, do you want any differences that you noticed or any ways that using the technology through the COVID pandemic has helped? Or helped with your marketplace?
Well, not with the marketplace, really. I mean, more in terms of what the customers are trying to do with the marketplace, I guess,
Sure.
or what they're trying to buy there. So we haven't seen things slow down as much in this area. Some other areas, yes, but not in the initiatives. But we have seen is more of a focus on initiatives that enable remote connections, right? And remote condition monitoring, remote engineering, product development, things like that allow people to work from home rather than requiring that they be on site in the manufacturing or engineering facility. So we're seeing a shift maybe, but not really a slowdown. A lot of companies are still very, very active in moving forward with their digital transformations.
Certainly. And I'm guessing, Andrew, you probably have seen maybe some different requests come in, right, for different capabilities or functionality to be enabled because of the current environment?
Yeah, we're seeing actually a lot of really interesting innovation. A couple of examples that I'd like to share. One is with 3M. So 3M obviously is a provider of PPE, but a lot of their products were being, overpriced in the reseller channel and weren't getting to the hospitals or providers as efficiently as they normally would, because the processes were breaking down. So what they actually did is they took our internal collaboration product, Quip, and they made it available to their suppliers, to their distributors, and to the medical providers. And so they had kind of a full ecosystem collaboration on what was coming from a production perspective, where the bottlenecks were and who should get it and how. And so that was one example. Another was a major automotive OEM actually didn't give their assembly line workers company emails. So once they were home because of the pandemic in March and April, they literally had no way to communicate with them. And so they tasked our marketing product, Marketing Cloud, to essentially take those employees on a journey to keep them connected to GM and the processes as they eventually got back to work. So we're seeing a lot of really interesting innovations of different ways of using the tools, given the challenges.
That's great. That's helpful to hear. Excellent. Well, I know we're getting close to the time, so I think maybe we'll wrap it here. I think that's a good ending, right? Is the whole notion of leveraging that ecosystem for innovation and for solving some of these, these challenges that we're facing because of the pandemic, and all about speed and agility, right? I think that name or those words have come out a few times today. So I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you so much for participating today. And thank you, audience, for your great questions. There are some more that came in, but we can answer those offline. And I just want to remind everybody that a copy of the recording will be shared with you after today. And also you can access that Smart Ecosystems report and also that playbook that I mentioned. So thank you all for your attendance today. Goodbye.